Evening, everyone. Stick my glasses on, see what's going on. Wonderful to see you all. Thanks so much for coming along, all those joining in the great room and all those I know that are joining online for our tonight's very special guest. It's a real thrill for me to welcome back to the RSA Sir John Kay. You all know of John, world-renowned economist, columnist, author, business person, the author of many books. I forget the number now you're up to, John. It's about...
I've lost count, I'm afraid.
Lots. Let's just call it lots. Going way back, so I first came across John's name as a young economist reading Kay and King on the UK tax system, former boss of mine and John. The definitive text on the UK tax system then, probably still is actually. That's how many years is that, John? That's 40 years?
No, it was 1979 we published it.
There you go. And the thing about reading any of John's books or columns that I've found, and one of the reasons I have long admired his work, is that it's not just that you learn something, because you always do, but actually John thinks about the problem in a completely different way than anyone else and forces you to rethink even how you conceive of the question. And that will again be true this evening, I know, when John talks about his most recent book, The Corporation of the 21st Century, Why, open brackets, almost, close brackets, everything we're told about business is wrong. You're in for a real treat. The format will be, first John will say some words to summarize the book in about 15 or 20 minutes, then he and I will have a quick Q&A, and then we'll go very quickly to you, both online and in the room, for your thoughts, questions to John, and we'll close at 7 sharp to enable you all to get away. And with that, without further ado, please welcome to the stage Sir John Kay.
Well, thanks, Andy. And it's a great pleasure. This is, I think, the 5th or 6th book which I've launched in this room at the RSA. So I'm very pleased to be here and do it again this evening. And what I'm going to talk about, and the subject I've been given, just to avoid any doubt, I'm not going to summarize the book. If I could summarize it in 20 minutes, I would not have written an 800, 500-page book. I'm going to focus, however, on a central issue, which is of particular concern to everyone at RSA, which is the issue of the relationship between business and the communities in which business operates. And that's not a new issue, to put it mildly, but it's an issue which I remember talking about. Andy has talked a bit about history. I remember talking about that 30 years ago, in a moment which in some ways has resonance with the present time. Because it was 1996, and there was a Labour government, not yet, but a Labour government in waiting, in effect, and looking for ideas about how it could shift the British economy in somewhat new directions. And one of these was concerned with the relationship between business and the community. And much of what was written about that time, some of it was by me, far more impact was made by a book by Will Hutton and several other people like Tony Giddens at the time. But there was talk then of stakeholding versus shareholding as a motivation for the way in which business was structured. And I went to give a talk to the CBI conference in 1996 because they wanted to know what this debate, what this discussion was about. So I went to Harrogate. This is a nicer picture of Harrogate than my recollection of it at the time. But that was Harrogate where the conference was held. And I focused what I said to people then on this, which is the story of the mission statement of what was, for most of the 20th century, Britain's leading industrial corporation, ICI. And this was what ICI said about itself. ICI aims to be the world's leading chemical company, serving customers internationally through the innovative and responsible application of chemistry and related sciences. Through achievement of our aim, they went on to say, we will enhance the wealth and well-being of our shareholders, our employees, and the communities which we serve and in which we operate. That was what Britain's leading corporation of the 20th century said about itself. It was about the responsible application of chemistry and related sciences to business. And that was what ICI did. ICI was formed in the 1920s as a merger of businesses specializing in dyestuffs and explosives, which were traditional large areas of chemical business. And ICI was formed then as part of a process which was then called rationalization, which was essentially finding leading companies internationally in Britain and trying to turn them into national leaders. You can see from the title, Imperial Chemical Industries, how immodest the aspirations for that business actually were. But you will see that again and again in the companies that were created in that particular era. They were specialized in a particular area. It was the responsible application of chemistry and related sciences. They were specialized in a particular area. They were planned to be international in operation. And that was what happened at ICI. ICI was, as I've described, based on explosives and dyestuffs. In the later interwar period, industrial applications of chemistry moved to petrochemicals and fertilizers. And then in the Second World War, applications moved towards pharmacology. The Second World War gave a large impetus to that, and ICI actually set up the first plant in the UK for the commercial production of penicillin. But in the course of the 1940s, ICI decided that perhaps the future of chemistry and business was in pharmaceuticals. So ICI set up a specialist pharmaceutical division. It actually lost money, that part of ICI, for 20 years. It's quite hard to imagine a similar company there sustaining a money-losing activity for 20 years. But it ceased to be a money-losing utility operation when chemists in ICI labs, led by Sir James Blackwell, discovered beta blockers, which were the first effective drug against hypertension and became an international blockbuster drug. It's worth noting that James Black, who led that ICI team, left ICI soon after the promotion of beta blockers. He went to join another large British company, SmithKline. And in the course of doing that, or working there, he discovered another blockbuster drug, which was dealt with stomach ulcers more effective than any previous drug had done. I'll come back to why Black left in just a moment. But the future of chemistry and business was now very much in pharmaceuticals. But the recruitment of Black had been part of an operation which gained in universities the title of the Milk Round. It was a world in which companies like ICI, Shell, Unilever, and so on would go to universities to recruit their brightest graduates, who would typically go on to have careers in these companies. Some of them moved to other companies, but rarely. They had careers, went on to become chief executives of these companies, or the most successful did. And that was the promotion of professional management as a career, which was part of what companies like ICI had been intended to do, and in fact did. But actually, that kind of way of thinking about business, of this broad conception of purpose, both internationally as well as in Britain, that faded rather as actually business became more and more financially oriented. And in the early 80s, ICI made the rather unexpected appointment of John Harvey Jones to be chief executive. Harvey Jones was probably the first figure in British business to be a chief executive, was a widely known and quoted figure. It was part of a change which in due course produced Donald Trump and other supposed business leaders who have roles outside business. But nevertheless, Harvey Jones was basically an ICI lifer. But you will see that the direction of ICI was being changed. And the dramatic change occurred in the early 90s, because what happened in the early 90s was an aggressive industrial figure, James Hansen, whose company, Hansen Trust, took over a number of sleepy British businesses, built up a large stake in ICI, not a huge stake, but a stake. And there was some suggestion that what Hansen was doing was he was going to take over ICI and make more money out of it. And ICI reformed itself and its way of thinking in response to that. So this mission statement, which had been ICI's for half a century, became this. ICI, this is the mission statement from the start of the 1994 annual report. ICI's objective is to maximize value for our shareholders by focusing on businesses where we have market leadership, a technological edge, and a world competitive cost base. You can see quite large differences in these two statements, and quite large differences in the style of business which that implies. And I've talked on these lines a few times, and have quite a lot of correspondence from people who worked in ICI during these changes, who talk about the ways in which the way business was talked about changed as a result of this. So this was a shift from essentially financially, or from a industrial-oriented business that talked about and talked with success about applying chemistry in a range of industrial activities, to a essentially static-looking business, not seeking out new opportunities so much as exploiting existing ones, with a heavy financial orientation as to what it did. Well, one of the interesting things, and going back to the things I said in 1996, is that we know what happened subsequently. And this is roughly the story of what happened to ICI. You will see that ICI, in an interesting way, its fortunes mirror those of Tony Blair, one might say. It reaches, the shareholder price rises quite markedly initially. It reaches a peak in the summer of 1997, and thereafter there's a steady decline until 10 years later. The rump of ICI is taken over by a Dutch company, AkzoNobel, and although some of the classic ICI products, Dulux paint and the like, are still on the shelves of DIY shops, ICI, Britain's leading industrial company of the 20th century, is no more. There's a remark which is often made in the economic world, which is the plural of anecdote is not data. But actually, this is an anecdote that repeats itself many times. The most remarkable thing is that in 1990, Britain's leading industrial company was ICI. Its second leading industrial company was GEC. And the story of GEC is surprisingly similar. GEC was tightly controlled by chief executive Arnold Weinstock. In 1996, Weinstock retired, and a new management team took control of the business. That lasted 4 years, 5 years. In 2001, GEC finally disintegrated, having paid a great deal of money during the dot-com boom to buy businesses that they thought had a future, and selling businesses which turned out to have more of a future than they perceived. What happened to both these companies was what happened to many companies during that period, which was the financial orientation focused on Jack Welch, who was proclaimed by Fortune magazine the manager of the century in 1996. The manager of the century emphasized making the numbers. Making the numbers and doing the deals. These were the things that mattered to the people in the city and stock market. Making the numbers means coming up with earnings reports which are at least in line with what you've led the market to expect. And doing the deals is restructuring business. In a remarkable phrase, people in business today talk about corporate activity, by which they mean the businesses that they will buy and sell, not the products they will buy and sell. Corporate activity in that ordinary sense is another matter altogether, and something a lot of people in the city are not really very interested in. That's the story of ICI. There are two vignettes which I'd throw in to enrich the story. One is, back in the 90s, I talked to James Black, who was the person who led the team at ICI that discovered beta blockers. Black actually probably created more shareholder value than anyone else in British history, because what Black did was the basis of ICI's pharma division, and it was the basis of SmithKline's blockbuster drugs, and finally Glaxo, then a small British company, refocused its research program in the light of Black's work and Black's success, and came up with Zantac, which for more than a decade was the best-selling drug in the world. So Black, you can argue, made more money for shareholders than any other business person in the 20th century. But of course, Black was not primarily a business person. He told me he left ICI because ICI management, he said, wanted him to be on the road selling beta blockers to doctors at conferences around the world. That wasn't what Black wanted to do. He wanted to discover more drugs using the therapeutic ideas which he'd come up with for ICI. And of course, that was what he did. And Black said to me, I used to tell managers at ICI that if they wanted to make money, there were easier ways to make money than in drug research. And then he shook his head and said, how wrong could I have been? I think of it, he says, as obliquity. You very often succeed by approaching indirectly the goals which you have. And that was the story of ICI. It was the story of a whole number of successful businesses. It was the story of what had happened at ICI. It was the story of what happened in General Electric. It was a story, archetypally, of Simon Marks at Marks and Spencer. These are people whose objective and aspiration was to build great businesses. And by building great businesses, they created lashings of shareholder value. And to take the most fetid business figure of the moment, Elon Musk may be the richest man in the world, But that's not because he set out to become the richest man in the world. It's because he set out to revolutionize transport in various ways, and incidentally became the richest man in the world. And whether there would be these businesses commanding these values, if Musk were not there, is another matter altogether. Similarly, Mark Zuckerberg was not setting out to become ultra-rich. He was setting out to attract hotties to his Harvard dormitories, and incidentally, the mechanism for doing that, the principle of obliquity as well, was one that made him a very successful businessman and enabled him to make a lot of money. So are there general lessons to be drawn from this, all of this? Well, there's another vignette which I want to add, which is I told the story of ICI 10 years after I'd first told it. I gave a talk in 2006 in which I talked about ICI's change in mission statement and what had happened to its share price subsequently. And a few days later, I got a rather pained letter from ICI's Vice President for Corporate Social Responsibility. The letter includes the brochure, which I'm sure all of you have seen from one company or another. It was printed on recycled paper. It showed pictures of happy ethnic minorities and people in wheelchairs working at ICI, and proclaimed the strength of ICI's commitment to social responsibility. Of course, the letter which accompanied it said, to paraphrase only slightly, we may have screwed up the business in the last 10 years, but we did a great job on corporate social responsibility. Putting right the relations between business and the community is not a matter of DEI initiatives, ESG, and the like. In my view, the purpose of business and the purposes of professional management are to create great businesses in the way people at ICI or GEC or whatever, or these companies did. The purpose, business is successful when you create, Marks and Spencer would be another stunning example of this, a great business, and shareholder value follows from that. It's not shareholder value is an unimportant objective, it's a perfectly legitimate objective. And there's no reason why a company that successfully adds value should not and will not distribute some of that added value to shareholders. But Black was right when he talked about obliquity, and the most successful companies in creating shareholder value have not been the ones that were most dedicated to the creation of shareholder value. Jack Welch, as I've already mentioned, was a crowned manager of the century. If one looks what is the long-term impact of Jack Welch on business, well, General Electric, which was Welch's company, in 2001, when he retired, the share price had multiplied itself by 10. It's since lost most of that value, and General Electric has broken itself up into what were the historic businesses of GE, aerospace, healthcare, and plastics. Being America's leading electrical company, rather, in 1980 was not a bad position to be in. It's not a position that is reflected in what that company does now, which are the things that it was doing in 1970. What I'm trying to argue for is a reset of the relations between business and the community, not a regime that replaces shareholder value with some different objective. It's a matter of saying that the way in which that this is the way of describing what successful business actually seeks to do, what ICI sought to do, what GEC sought to do, what Marks and Spencer sought to do. And the creation of shareholder value, in these cases, in extraordinary degree, comes from that. It isn't by doing this. And it isn't by doing what too many businesses have found in talking about the relationship between their business and society in the last 20, 30 years. It's not about virtue signaling. It's not, I think, the example with which I begin with the book and which I commend to you comes from the case, a class action led by Arkansas teachers against Goldman Sachs. The basis of that action is that Goldman Sachs, its ethics statement, which is published on its website, its annual report and so on, begins, our clients' interests always come first. The complaint of Arkansas teachers is that this ethics statement misled them into thinking that Goldman Sachs shares were appropriate investments for Arkansas teachers and other pensioners of various kinds who sought to invest. What's interesting is that the Goldman's defense of this is not that the statement is true. It is that the opposite. It was that the statement is so obviously untrue that the claim that ICI, that Arkansas teachers were misled by this statement is absurd. And it's not just Goldman Sachs who presented this argument. The American Chamber of Commerce filed a friend of the court brief in the case, which said, and literally said, all companies make statements like this. If the findings of the court were in favour of the plaintiffs, they would in future make statements of this kind at their peril. There's another way of mitigating that peril, which is you should only make statements that you have some genuine intention of living up to. That is what corporate ethics is really about, and it is building great businesses. Thank you.
Thank you, John, for that. And beautiful, brilliant examples to bring home the key points from the richness of this book. And let me kick things off with a few questions from my side. And I want to start with getting your perspective of the history of this. I mean, as you say in the book, businesses, big businesses in particular, start today from a position of quite deep mistrust and suspicion among many members of the public.
Yeah.
Love the product, hate the producer, in the language you use. And is this, 'twas ever thus? Has big business always been unpopular? Or is there something special about where we are right now, do you think?
It's become much more extreme. I've talked a bit in what I've just been saying about ethics and business. And when I talk about ethics and business, the school of ethics I want to go along with is the Aristotelian one of virtue ethics. That is saying, in effect, that you can't have a single definition of what is a good business. But we all know what good businesses are. And we'd all identify the same companies, or pretty much the same companies, if we were asked to say what a good business is. Now, Aristotle, with a great many successors, was suspicious about business which is not engaged in primary produce about business which is engaged in buying and reselling, the kind of activities which are a large part of what the City of London and other financial centres, which to which business has become increasingly accountable. And that's what they're concerned with. And therefore I think there's a story which runs up to about the 1960s in both Britain and the United States. The 1960s were, in many ways, a pivotal decade. And it was the era of, the end of an era in which people sought to develop management as a professional activity in the way I was describing earlier, that bright graduates were attracted to these large organizations. Now, the milk round is much more about how can I make money, and the sought after participants in the milk round are consultancies and investment banks. It's not these great companies anymore.
And keying off that a little bit, I mean, one of the points you make in the book is that this word capital is used a lot.
Yeah.
But hugely misunderstood as to what capital counts for businesses these days. It's not the physical stuff of the days of yore, but rather the human stuff.
Yes.
Both the expertise of people and the collaboration and connection between them, the kind of social capital as well as the human capital, if you like. And that was such an interesting and core part of the book. I wonder if you could elaborate. I mean, it's so core to the RSA's work in general, and this year in particular. I'd love you to elaborate a bit on that aspect in particular, John, about how businesses are different.
Yeah, and the idea that business, modern business, is about putting together capabilities to find new products and new solutions. That's what Apple and Facebook are about.
Yeah.
And the value of Apple and Facebook lies in the people, not in the stuff. In fact, if you look at the balance sheets of Amazon or Facebook, you will discover that they don't own anything. They don't own anything. You may have seen a warehouse that has Amazon painted on the side. Amazon almost certainly doesn't own it. The largest owner of Amazon warehouses in the world is a company called Prologis, which probably hardly anybody in this room has ever heard of. Amazon doesn't own, well, it does in a sense own the stuff in the warehouses, but you have paid for it with your credit card to Amazon long before Amazon have paid the supplier. Amazon has negative working capital in that kind of sense. And I can tell this story over and over again about modern businesses. It's not about the stuff. The productions, the product is dematerialized. Again, the iPhone, it's not more stuff. It's actually more things in one very small computer you can carry around in your pocket. And that's symbolic of the corporation which Apple is. It's putting things together rather than traditional manufacturing of the kind which business used to be like.
And I'd like to get your perspective on the role of business just at the moment in explaining the soggy growth rates that many economies are facing, including here in the UK. Because one of the stories there that's often told, including by me, is a lack of that Schumpeterian creative destruction. Not enough innovation, not enough entry and exit, actually. Not enough people within those businesses driving the sort of innovation that you mentioned Black had done in ICI and then SmithKline and then Glaxo. Do you hold to that view? Is this a lack of business dynamism that lies behind some of the lack of good growth that we've seen, do you think, John?
I think there's truth in that, especially as far as Britain is concerned. That it's quite important that companies like ICI don't really exist anymore in Britain. And would James Black today go and join ICI? I'm pretty sure he wouldn't. It was very clear from talking to Black that what Black enjoyed was not the business, but the opportunity to be supported in a lab. And incidentally, this is obliquity again, he made a lot of money for ICI shareholders in the process of doing it. But there's another question I'd raise, which is how good all this data is. We're talking about a world in which the iPhone has replaced the standalone telephone that my parents used to have in the hall of their house, in which the record player has given way to something you can put in your pocket and so on. These things have changed our lives. It used to be the case that to get a taxi, one had to go out in the street and wave one down. Now you press a button and it comes. And I can tell the story over and over again. My productivity is improved by orders of magnitude in writing this book. Because if I think I know something, I can check it on the internet instead of having to send someone to the library for an afternoon to see whether I remembered correctly and so on. Some of this shows up in our GNP measures. Not much of it does. But I think the ways in which we have moved away from having the ICI type of corporation to having the modern, financially oriented business does have something to do with the loss of dynamism in the British economy. And I struggle to think who our James Black figures now are.
Final question from me. So please prepare your questions, both those in the room and online, and we'll go to those next. Just building on that last point, John, though, one of the points you make in the book very elegantly, and indeed you make it in your book with Mervyn as well, on radical uncertainty, is that is intrinsic to the innovation engine. There's no escaping it.
Yeah.
You need to embrace that ambiguity, embrace that uncertainty, if you are to have any hope of innovating and therefore growing and therefore thriving businesses. And that all sounds good. I think you have lots of people nodding along to that. But of course, the world is serving up quite a lot of uncertainty right now. And I'm sure for many business people, this feels like the time to be ducking under the duvet, rather than striking out into a unknown. Any reflections on how a business might deal with this kind of compounded uncertainty, the innovation uncertainty, the environmental uncertainty that we're living through?
I mean, the key words that Mervyn and I came up with in that book are really robustness and resilience. And the way you do that, whether as an individual or as a business, is you build strategies for your life, in effect, that are robust and resilient to things you don't know. And we thought about robustness and resilience in the context of complex engineering systems, where redundancy means building things to greater tolerances than you think you can get away with. And modularity means creating systems where even if a bit of it fails, the whole system taken as a whole did not. One of the interesting things about the financially oriented businesses I've been talking a bit about and what I've said is that they regarded modularity and redundancy as signs of inefficiency. They were things that you ought to be eliminating or trying to do so.
Fantastic. Let's go to the audience. So there's a roving mic, or indeed mics. So hang on for that before speaking, so that everyone can hear your question. Let's start at the very back, actually, to make it easy. Then we'll wend our way forward. Doesn't matter.
Thanks, Andy, and thanks, John, for this really great talk. My name is Delilah Rothenberg, and I'm with the Pre-Distribution Initiative. And, I think now is an interesting time. I'm American, and in the United States, shareholder rights are being questioned. And I think a lot of American investors, or international investors as well, who identify as responsible investors are concerned that some of these rights are going to reduce their ability to ensure that companies are held accountable. And yet, as you pointed out in your talk, a lot of the reasons why I think shareholder rights are also questioned is because they also have been used to extract value from companies. And I'm just wondering if you can reflect on that a bit, because it seems to be a blind spot in the responsible investment community that these rights are sort of a double-edged sword. Thanks.
Well, there are quite a lot of things involved in the answer to that question. One, which I can't emphasize too strongly, is that rethinking business in the way I described is not about printing that corporate social responsibility brochure, and a lot of it has been. It's the idea that if you have a big business, you can appoint a CSR, ESG department to deal with the ethics while you get on with helping yourself to the money. And that's the reality of a great deal of American business. Real business ethics are about what you do in the business. So as far as I'm concerned, it's a matter of restoring legitimacy by taking this historic ICI view of what business is for. It's about serving customers and managing the job opportunities of employees in ways that enable your organization, taken as a whole, to add value.
This gentleman next, I think he had his hand up first, so.
Yeah, thank you very much. Fantastic talk, John, and thank you, Andy. My question is this. This talk has come at an incredibly apposite time for me, because I've just left ACOM, a large American shareholder-owned company, where I felt that the financial tail was starting to wag the technical dog, and I've joined Arup, which is British-owned, and it's shareholder, it's employee-owned, and it's in a trust. So in terms of an alternative to this shareholder mega corporation model, could you give me some confidence that that kind of employee-owned trust is an appropriate model and is sustainable in the old-fashioned sense of long-lasting?
And there are not many examples of companies that have placed their ownership in this sense in the hands of a trust. But there are a great many. There are successful and unsuccessful non-profit organizations. For me, professional management is not about making money for shareholders. It's about achieving all these things I described. And Arup is an example of a company which recognizes that business has multiple objectives. And to say one, which may be either making money for managers, which is the reality of Goldman Sachs, or making money for shareholders, which is not the reality of very many companies, but is a rhetoric which they happily aspire to. I think that's not quite the choice which we have. Successful businesses add value, and one of the jobs of management is to achieve a distribution of that added value that meets the requirements of everyone.
Fantastic. And we go to the front here, and then I'll get the sides afterwards, don't worry. Start here. Thank you.
This is totally weird. Is it on? Is it on?
You're on.
This is totally weird and not coordinated. I've been at Arup for 32 years. I don't know this. I happened to be next in the queue to ask my question. working for the cooperative that no one knows exists. I just wanted to reflect on what you were saying quite a lot about, what you were alluding to was how you attract and retain the best people. And it occurs to me, I deal a lot in recruitment, and we cannot compete. We have incredibly exciting engineering jobs, but we can't compete with the management accountants, the accountants and the big banks. The first week of your course of physics at Imperial College, you are being wooed by the big banks. We can't compete with that. So there's something else going on there.
Yeah, so this goes back to the discussion we had with Andy really earlier. The growth of the city, the financial services industries, particularly in the UK, has attracted large numbers of bright young students into it in ways that have had a significant opportunity cost for the rest of the British economy. I was struck by the fact that we had a dinner at St John's, my Oxford College, where we invited a range of alumni whom I'd taught to come and talk. And it wasn't difficult to find people who'd been successful in politics, who'd been successful in finance, who'd been successful in media. The bizarre thing was when we looked for someone who was in the C-suite of a major company, we couldn't find one in Britain. We had to go to France, where the PDG of a large French company was in my tutorial group in St John's. And making this point with an audience that had some French people in it, they made, I think correctly, the point that it's inconceivable that what I was describing would be true in France. In France, when the analogue would have been I've been teaching at a Grande École, and an alumni of that would be represented all across major positions in France.
That's true.
It's not like that in Britain.
I have the centrist questions, so we're getting right-wing questions now. A couple here. Ashok first, and then two in front.
John, terrific talk, and Andy, terrific discussion. As an ex-entrepreneur, I believe entrepreneurialism is about building great businesses. So why do we have so few large growth companies in the UK, and yet there are so many in the US and Asia?
So hold that thought, John. I'm going to collect a couple more, if that's okay. Yes, in front, and then the lady in front here as well.
Alan Barlow, I was the CEO of a multinational chemical engineering group. You've spoken about, and rightly so, about creating a great company, about robust and resilience. But from my perspective, it comes down to one single point. It depends upon the moral compass of the CEO. If there isn't a moral compass from the CEO, along with the finance, etc., it's doomed to failure. Your view, please.
Fantastic. We'll just take one more, John, and then we'll let you...
Mine's actually related quite similarly to Ashok's question. Scarlett Brown, I work at Board Intelligence, spend a lot of time with those C-suite and board members trying to persuade them that some of this is important. Similarly to the previous question, I'm really struck by a lot of what you've talked about. Really, for me, the word that keeps coming back in my head is innovation. And I really notice it when we're working with boards and C-suite and CEOs. When we talk about innovation, a lot of the kind of thinking in the kind of modern day is coming from companies like Apple and Amazon and Google and their ways of working. And Amazon have done a lot to create this incredibly innovative culture. And I'm wondering what we can learn from some of the companies that you talked about in your book, even perhaps, dare I say it, from the arts, and things that perhaps we could do from an RSA perspective, or how are we driving this innovative desire to create things within the companies? I'd love it if you had any examples from some of the companies that perhaps you mentioned.
Three fantastic questions, John.
Right. There are quite a range of things there. The moral compass of the CEO. A lot of what is written about business is what I call the great man theory of business history. That it's thanks to Steve Jobs, Bill Gates, and you can all list the same names, that we have great businesses. Actually, I'm perfectly sure we would all be walking around with computers in our pockets, small computers in our pockets, even if Bill Gates and Steve Jobs had never existed. These products exist because the time and the technology that created them had come into being. And not to say these weren't creative or talented people, they were, but actually they were the lucky beneficiaries of a moment in time. And actually that's true of most of the supposed great men of business. That's a bit contrary to the observation about moral compass. And my view of that is that CEO of a large corporation can do a lot of damage to the moral compass of the organization. I'm less convinced that they can turn a weak organization round. And I think the great success of some of the companies I've been talking about is having a culture that was built up from a great many people in the organization. I've never forgotten the time I got a retired CEO of a large British company to come and talk to my class at London Business School. And at the end of it, he said quietly to me, "You know, these kids regard being CEO as a prize, not a responsibility." And it seemed to me that encapsulated almost exactly the negativity of the change which has occurred across the decades I've been talking about.
Growth companies, Ashok? Absence of British growth companies.
Yeah, I've sometimes thought if Black were around now, what would he be doing? And I'm sure Black would not have enjoyed talking to the VCs who would be pursuing him and trying to persuade him to get into business. I'm sure Black did not want to think about where the paychecks for his group were coming from in 3 weeks' time, or what paid the rent. These things are burdensome and uninteresting for people like that. I think, as we were saying earlier, the creation of great companies is about a combination of things. And Black was a brilliant pharmacologist. He was not a business person. And the opportunity he had, or seemed to have for a bit, to work in a comfortable lab operation at ICI was what created the business there. When I talked to him, actually, back in the 90s, he was working in what was effectively his own lab, which was supported by Johnson & Johnson, as much as a philanthropic version endeavour, as actually as a way of finding new drugs. And of course it was what he did at ICI that got the Nobel Prize.
Let's switch left wing. I think we've got a question here.
Thank you so much. You started the conversation saying you don't think that this is a conflict between shareholder value and stakeholder value, but if businesses' role is to either create or solve a problem, and the way that they're measured for their success is now shareholder value, which I think has led to a lot of the financialization corporations you discussed, how do we shift that? If it's not stakeholder value, what is it? I liked the ICI, 80s vision statement, but how does that actually extrapolate into real change for these large corporations today?
Hold that thought, John. We'll collect two more. Your hand was next, I think. Thank you.
Hi. My question was on a similar vein, actually. It was on, with a background of kind of austerity in this country and growing social inequality, and perhaps a lack of good examples of people to look up to as they've been growing up in terms of these big companies that you speak to. Do you think it's a lack of expectation that feeds the environment of these companies not behaving that way, or is it kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy? And so how far do we measure these other markers of success if finance is the focus? How can we financially measure other things to drive different goals?
Fantastic. Let's go here, and then we'll ask John to sweep those up.
Thank you very much. I wondered, John, whether you have any views on the B Corporation movement. It seems to be a movement that's really seeking to realign business objectives with some of the other things that you've discussed, and yet recently it's come under criticism as purpose washing by some other organisations. So just B Corporations and your thoughts there.
John?
Right. To deal briefly with the B Corporation story, I think I'm hostile to the idea that we can have nice businesses and nasty businesses, and you have to decide whether you're a nice one or a nasty one. I think all businesses have the same environment we're describing and have the same multiplicity of objectives and goals. And that comes back to what is being said earlier about the role of finance and financial measurement as the criterion for business success. What we've talked about is a world in which a culture changed from being one that had people building great businesses. We mentioned Simon Marx, whom I guess people will have heard of because they've at least heard of Marks and Spencer. I doubt if people have heard of Harry McGowan, or many people have heard of Harry McGowan, who was CEO of ICI for 20 years in its critical development. The idea that business is a financially oriented operation rather than one run by people who aim is to create businesses and for whom, in my terms, or my former chief executive's terms, being CEO is a responsibility, not a prize. That's how his generation of senior managers saw it. And I think that's what we need to get back to. And we need to de-emphasize the role of finance, both in attracting careers, as attractive careers for people who might otherwise go into business, and of ways of measuring what it is that business has actually done and achieved.
The witching hour is upon us, so I think we should probably draw things to a close. Thanks everyone for watching online. Some of the online submitted questions were asked in the room, so I wasn't ignoring you. And if you want to hear some more, by the way, online you'll find links to John's book where you can purchase it. And for those in the room, you can purchase it outside with John's signature in it, if you wish. John's kind of did some book signing outside after we finish. The only thing that's ranks just after John's book for those thirsty and hungry to learn more is the fantastically innovative products available in our cocktail bar downstairs, which do pop along after you had your book signed to sample some of those. Thank you everyone for a wonderful set of questions. But first and foremost, let's all of us thank John in the usual way for an absolutely fantastic talk.